Buckingham Palace, and that's where Nina Dos Santos is. Nina, what are you seeing where you are?
Thanks so much, Erin. Well, we can see the procession arriving here at Queen's Gardens outside Buckingham Palace. And if you can see the Grenadier Guards, we've also seen the Scots Guards parading. And in fact, the parade was started just a few minutes ago by the Royal Navy cadets as they were the first to arrive here. What we're expecting is the King's Guard to give a royal salute from the forecourt of Buckingham Palace. I don't know whether you can see in some of these images, but very unusually, the main gates to Buckingham Palace are actually open. And earlier we saw the staff from the royal household file out and line up, presumably to bow to Her Majesty's coffin as it passes by. Buckingham Palace had 491 staff in all the royal palaces and royal household serving Her Majesty the Queen. 188 bedrooms alone in Buckingham Palace are dedicated to staff, and many of those will be wanting to pay their respects. In terms of the atmosphere here, I can tell you it is electric, dignified, and also extremely quiet. It has been like that for the last 2 hours, even during the funeral service itself, which was broadcast here to the crowds on loudspeakers. You could hear a pin drop. Nobody said a word. Everybody was extremely respectful. And now they're waiting, of course, for the coffin to pass through here before making its way up to Wellington Arch, just about half a mile away. Erin?
Just about half a mile away. Nina, thank you so much as they're making their way there to Wellington Arch, where then the Queen's coffin will be put into the hearse to begin the next stage of this journey out to Windsor, where there will be another procession and a ceremony, and that, of course, is where you are, Anderson.
It is, Erin. You cannot help but think of the tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, who have not only lined up to see the Queen lie in state, but who also have lined the Mall there, are lining up here in Windsor, anywhere they can to get a glimpse and to be a part of this history. This is something that we have never seen in our lifetime, and they will be able to tell their children and grandchildren about it.
I think that's right, and you know, look at all those different types of uniform reflecting the Commonwealth, not just the United Kingdom today, also the National Health Service, as we were saying earlier on, talking about more recent crises and the way the Queen intervened basically at that time and gave this amazing address to the nation, didn't she, from Windsor Castle, where we are, where she really got everyone behind the lockdown, which was something Boris Johnson at the time asked her to do. We're seeing the procession go past Buckingham Palace, which of course is the seat of British monarchy. She hasn't spent much time there in recent years. She was never particularly fond of it, I don't think, actually, Anderson. She was always revert to going to Windsor when she was down in the southeast of England.
What was it about Buckingham Palace?
Well, it's quite an austere place to live. It feels quite corporate when you're inside. It's currently being completely refurbished, so Charles will have something different when he goes there. But she loved her horses, and in Windsor she was able to ride her horses, even though there's a riding school and a whole set of stables behind Buckingham Palace.
Windsor is also where, I mean, during the war, she started to come as a child.
Yes. She did, and this is where she was protected.
Well, she was protected, and she did her first ever broadcast from here when she was just 14 to the children who'd been evacuated to America and Canada, and she said that it's for the children of the future to make the world a better place, and that is what she tried to do. I think of President Biden talking yesterday about how she tried to improve things. We're all better to have known her, and really thinking about how the emphasis on service. We saw that wonderful service in Westminster Abbey, drawn from the 1662 prayer book, and the Archbishop of Canterbury talking about her life of service, and that's really been such a constant in what we've been talking about over the last 10 days, her service, and how she said to the Commonwealth, as you were just saying, Max, that she committed her heart and soul every day. And I think about how she too served in the forces. She served in World War II as a trainee ambulance driver to drive men from the front to the hospitals, and that's why veterans and military men and military service women have always been so important to her, and why she wanted them to have a key role today.
So extraordinary, though, to see the procession heading toward, as it nears Buckingham Palace, this place which, though she may not have loved it as much as Windsor or others, spent so much time, and it is so iconic, and we think of the Queen when we think of Buckingham Palace. This will be the last time she will be near Buckingham Palace.
And you wonder what happens to Buckingham Palace now. I mean, certainly my view that a lot of tourists come to, it's probably the most visited tourist attraction in London. They come because of that idea that the monarch could be tweaking a curtain or could drive in or out at any time. But I don't think King Charles is particularly fond of it either, and he's still living at Clarence House as his London base.
Explain where Clarence House is in relation to Buckingham Palace.
So they're marching currently past Clarence House. It's, it's a 2-minute walk. It's along the Mall. It's connected to St James's Palace. It's beautiful inside. It feels like a country vicarage, if I can call it that, in the middle of London. And Prince Charles, as he was, really created this sanctuary of a garden. He's very into gardening, and it's beautiful. It's just on the left to where you're looking at now, there. And he's very happy there, and that's where the Queen Mother was as well. So they've got all of these properties. They now need to really think about how they're going to redistribute it.
So is it possible that King Charles will stay living at Clarence House and not move into Buckingham Palace?
I think it's very possible that it will become effectively an office space for the monarchy and a headquarters. Of course, he'll have his place he can stay there, but I don't know how likely that is. You've got the state apartments there, which will always be useful to greet heads of state and members of the public for garden parties out the back. But you wonder how they'll actually use it longer term.
It is just, I mean, as an American to watch this, this is just not something we have in the United States, a public ceremony like this. I mean, obviously with our history not being as deep, as long as British history.
But I think it reflects two things. As you say, not quite the same length of history in terms of what you're seeing, but also the fact there's no written constitution here. So all of these things actually end up becoming part of our constitution, how we do things. What order people are walking in here defines what order they are in the power structure. And all of this comes together to tell us what to do when there's a challenge coming up. But, I'm often asked, when there's a hung parliament or when there's all sorts of situations. In America, there's very clear solutions to that. We don't even have a system for if the Prime Minister becomes incapacitated. We sort of make it up as we go along. So when Boris Johnson was in hospital during with COVID, he just appointed his Deputy Prime Minister, but that isn't actually a formal role, the Deputy Prime Minister. We just sort of make it up. And what it all comes down to is that we've got a monarch who ultimately would have to make a decision if government couldn't, which is how the system works. And we say they don't have any authority, but ultimately they do if everything else falls apart.
And it's so moving, I think, looking at the Royal Navy soldiers. When you think that the Queen, she first met Prince Philip when she visited the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, where he was the top cadet. Then he went off to war and wrote to her throughout the war, and how much the war formed the Queen. She was just a young girl, evacuated to Windsor Castle, as we were saying. She served when she became 16 as in the Women's Auxiliary Service, and that's why veterans, the Navy, have always been so important to her. And it was interesting, Queen Rainier of Jordan, she was saying that the Queen was someone who always paid attention to every detail, that things weren't like they were because they happened that way, because the Queen wished them to be that way. So really, as you've been saying, this is the culmination of decades of planning. The Queen was looking at the planning, thinking about the planning right up until really not long before she passed away. And this is just how she would have wanted it. I think it's perfect. The precision, the respect, how the crowds are both sad but also celebrating her long reign. And it really makes me think of all the wonderful, wonderful royal celebrations we've been to together. We've been for the royal weddings, haven't we? And the jubilees. And this is the final moment of her reign. Such a great reign in which the British monarchy has been, I would say, the most popular it ever has been.
It is interesting in this country that, I mean, we have seen we saw Prince Charles and Diana in a carriage going down the Mall. If you have been alive over the last 50 years, you've grown up with the royal family. Their travails are things you have followed, their marriages, their deaths, and I think for people in this country, certainly, there is this sense of belonging to these people and sort of relationship to them, even if they've never met them or, I mean, they are always there. It's
a constant challenge for them. They're always trying to, particularly Prince of Wales, as he is now, trying to balance his public and private life. They are a family, And they are defined, like all families, by births, marriages and deaths. And that's what connects us all to their story. But they're also professionals and they feel they have a right to a private life. I think, you know, one of the most poignant things about today for me is watching young Prince George, who's in one of the cars you can see there behind the coffin. So the Prince and Princess of Wales have always been very careful to protect him, and their whole thing, you know, is absolutely their priority in life, to give their kids a sense of normality growing up, but they cannot deny what's coming to him. So they've made the decision to put him into the procession earlier and also into this parade. He's sitting in the car and he's looking out and seeing full ceremonial. He's not going to see this again until his grandfather dies. And this is the Prince and Princess of Wales saying, look, you've got to start soaking this in, you can't deny it, and this will all be yours one day. He will have this one day. And I think that that is the transition we're looking at, as well as the transition from Queen to King.
And there we are looking at Wellington Arch there. It was commissioned to celebrate Britain's victories in the Napoleonic Wars. And it was actually supposed to be a triumphal entrance to Buckingham Palace, but they abandoned it and took the statue of Wellington off the top. And this is the great moment where we will see the Queen moving from the gun carriage into the hearse and then on her journey to Windsor, where we are.
Don Lemon is joining our coverage. Don, you were here all last week, every step of the Queen's journey from Balmoral to London, and now on this day, her final journey to Windsor, right now about to pass Buckingham Palace.
You're right on, Anderson. Good morning to you. It is certainly interesting to watch this happen. As you know, it being in London, you hear that death march, the march there you've heard it for days now, and with the muffled drums, either the official march along London, along the Mall and throughout the city, or the bands just practicing with the muffled drums, the bells tolling as well. So we're watching this along the Mall and then to Buckingham Palace, and then to Wellington Arch, and then later for a private funeral at St. George's Cathedral. But I want to bring in now Trisha Goddard. Trisha, you've been watching this. What do you make of the funeral? It was certainly beautiful.
It is really beautiful, and I think for a Londoner as well, I think like most Londoners, we take all of this for granted. When you see it all together, you know, I've been running just in those places that we're seeing now. And I've grown up around them, but seeing this pomp and this circumstance actually makes me proud to be a Londoner, proud to be a Brit. And you know, one thing I've really noticed is that in America, you're really used to having the stars and stripes out everywhere. We are not as used to that in the UK. To see all the Union Jacks and to see all the royalty, it's something quite different. I think you would agree with me. You don't see as many flags. You don't see that pride in Britain. This has really restored the pride of Britain. It's brought people from all over the world to Britain. It's showing people what we do best, what Britain does like no other country can. And it actually makes me feel pretty proud, which is unusual for a Brit.
I agree with you, actually. It's the pride element of this, amongst the sorrow and everything that she represents. I mean, look at what we're watching here. It's the layers of service to a country, to a realm, whether it's the military, the people that even after, how many days is it now? 11 are still lining the streets. This is a nation brought to a standstill in respect for a queen that most of us really have only ever known. And I don't think we will ever see anything like this in our lifetime.
I want to get now to CNN's Nina DeSantis. She's at Buckingham Palace as they are making their way there, the Queen's cortege, making its way to Buckingham Palace. And what is the circular part of it is Queen Victoria Memorial. What are you seeing there, Nina?
Yeah, we're seeing the procession come right past us here at Queen's Gardens. It's facing now almost Buckingham Palace, and the gates of Buckingham Palace are very unusually left open. We saw earlier, Don, hundreds of staff file out, obviously in traditional mourning clothes of black, file out, wait outside. They've been standing there for about 45 minutes waiting to bow to the Queen. Remember that she had about 491 staff in her various palaces, many of them deeply committed to her because of her very, very long service. And they will be hoping to be able to pay their respects in first person, Don. We're also expecting the King's Guard to give a royal salute from inside the forecourt of Buckingham Palace as her coffin, of course, passes during this historic moment. Obviously, it'll be making its way to Constitution Hill. I'll just pause for a minute because this is the moment when the King's Guard is expected to bow to the coffin as we see it moving past Buckingham Palace, those gates open, and the staff also likely to themselves bow to their employer, the late Queen, but also, more importantly, their sovereign for 70 years. We're expecting this procession then to head up Constitution Hill to Apsley Way. As we've been telling our viewers, the procession is expected to arrive imminently in Wellington Arch. Now, Wellington Arch is an important place because it's named after a great military and war hero of the 1800s, the early Victorian times, the Duke of Wellington. It faces a monumental building called Apsley House, fondly known to many of us Londoners as Number 1 London. But you can see there the staff lined up to pay their respects. It's a very, very moving moment here. I can tell you, Don, the crowd is absolutely silent. I've seen some people stand on their toes to get a better shot at the same time as other people have bowed in front of the coffin.
Sure.
As we watch this happen, and when they take a pause, we will as well. What is it like to be there?
It's a huge moment. As a born and bred Londoner, I can tell you as a child, I grew up not very far from Buckingham Palace, and I remember with my sister and my mother, when we'd drive by, we'd always have a look up and see whether the Royal Standard was flying, to see whether the Queen was in. The Queen felt like a grandmother to a nation here, and it's I feel incredibly privileged firsthand to be able to witness this, as so many people among the crowds here probably do as well. But you've got to remember that this is a huge security operation. I'm looking at the crowds as we speak, and literally every meter or two you have a member of the army and a member of the police force. You have medics in the crowds on hand because people have been standing here for hours in case they faint or there's any kind of medical emergency, to make sure they can get help immediately so that these processions go as smoothly as possible. There's a real sense here today that this is an historic moment, one where the eyes of the world, more than 4 billion people, are looking at the United Kingdom. It is going to be one of the most televised events that we've ever been part of, you, me, Don, Anderson, all of us. And just a fact for you here, when the Queen was born in 1926, there were half the number of people on the planet at that time as the amount of people who are estimated to be watching this event here on screens around the world and also outside Buckingham Palace. Don?
Yeah. Sally, we have seen the Queen Consort, we've seen the Princess of Wales, also obviously the King, Charles III, heavy as a head, wears a crown. He is quite aware of the moment and what is ahead for him. I said earlier that was going to be a private service at St. George's, actually a smaller service than what happened at Westminster Abbey, and that the Queen did that because she wanted to get more people, right, at her funeral. Someone said, "You're probably going to need a bigger place, ma'am."
Yes, and that was very deliberate, and you know, she well remembers her own father's service at St. George's. So this is something that's going to have two parts, you know, the Westminster Abbey part and the smaller, in a way, more somber committal.
As we're looking at Buckingham Palace, usually we're not used to seeing it this way. Usually it's a wedding or something a little bit more festive, but not today, so.
Well, Buckingham Palace is mainly an office building. It's not much of a residence, and none of them who lived there have particularly enjoyed it. I remember when George VI became king, and they had to move over there, and the young Princess Elizabeth said, "Do you think we could build a tunnel underneath so we can go back and forth?" Pretty soon she came to love it and treasure the collections and the history. I mean, it is an incredibly historic place filled with memories, as well as you know, great paintings and pieces of furniture, and certainly she has memories of, or had memories of, World War II, when the King gave a Thanksgiving reception for soldiers. It's, you know, it's just it is the symbol, really, of the monarchy.
That's exactly right. It's the symbol. When you think about Balmoral as being a spiritual home or a summer retreat, Buckingham Palace is really the corporate headquarters. That is the administrative focal point. It is a symbol for the firm, for the monarchy itself. It is a symbol and a place of where people gather around for moments of national mourning, national rejoicing as well. It's the focal point for the Queen's Jubilee. It's 400 years of British history. That is what we're seeing when we think about Buckingham Palace.
And also the balcony, which is an iconic place where we see, most recently, we saw the Queen celebrating her Jubilee. We saw the end of World War II celebrated on VE Day and VJ Day. We've seen Buckingham Palace balcony for weddings, for her wedding, for all of the weddings. So it's a center of administrative work, and it's a center of, it's a place where they live, where they've entertained heads of state. And, but it's also a very core administrative center for the monarchy.
Well, I find it very interesting that we are, especially on this side of the pond, Americans are getting a lesson in history and monuments.
Yes.
To what the Mall is, not the mall.
Not the mall,
Buckingham
exactly.
Palace, right?
I couldn't.
Wellington Arch. And you're seeing all the great symbols of London, right? The River Thames and the Tower Bridge, as well as Big Ben. All of this playing a role in the Queen's
Absolutely. What we're
ceremony.
seeing is the splendor and the grandeur of London as a preeminent world, global capital city on full display here.
Don't you think we take it? We've taken
totally
it.
You're absolutely right. We totally take
I
it
have
for
been to
granted.
Buckingham Palace so many times,
Look at that shot
and
right
I
there. It's
can't
beautiful.
imagine having to live in Buckingham Palace. I mean, I've been to Windsor Castle many, many times, and I get that. Sandringham is gorgeous. Sandringham is a really lovely home. But Buckingham Palace, the thought of living there, it is a big dusty monument, but it is the jewel in the centre of the royal.
But
Being refurbished.
Isn't it? Isn't it sort
Being
of
refurbished.
British? It's a symbol of British stiff upper lip.
It's the symbol, I think, of everything. But actually, it was interesting listening to what Nina was saying about the fact that every time she used to drive past with her mother, she'd look to see if the Queen was home. I think whether you're British or not, that's what you associate with the royal family and the Queen and their home in the storybooks. And obviously, I guess, again, for many people who don't know the history of the royal family, and I include Brits in that, the crown, again, is something as well that you associate with this. But actually, I just think what we saw there was something incredibly beautiful, because we did just see the Queen pass by Buckingham Palace for the last time, and actually the last time really we saw her there was for the Jubilee celebrations. And I am so glad as a Brit that she made it that long, and she had that moment to see the British public celebrate her and thank her in that way, because once again she's still working, and we are thanking her.
It was something that profoundly affected her. I was talking to somebody who was with her at Balmoral in the beginning of August, and she couldn't stop talking about the size of the crowds. She was still overwhelmed. This is somebody who first saw a crowd like that when she was 9 months old.
May I jump in and ask you something? Because we were talking about the Queen Victoria Memorial, which is in front of the circular part, and the statue, that memorial in front of Buckingham Palace. You said the question is now, where will they put this Queen's memorial? Any idea?
Well, I think the best guess is somewhere in Parliament Square, somewhere where she can be really prominent on her own. Another possibility is something called the fourth plinth, which I think would diminish her. Maybe Prince Philip can go there, but it's a challenge. They're going to have to find a place which will reflect her 70 years of service and her greatness, really. And I'm sure people are thinking about it, but.
And then there's a question of who will actually be commissioned to do it.
Well,
because whoever does it, I mean, the eyes of the world will be on that statue. It's not just going to be just anyone. That's going to be a whole process in itself.
I mean, the Queen's mother and father have really lovely statues overlooking the Mall. Large statues, and Queen Victoria's is obviously the biggest, but I think something commensurate, if not even grander. Although the Queen maybe would object to that because she was essentially humble and modest. But I think she would
to bring it back to the pictures that we're seeing now and what the audience is viewing now in terms of the military band, the scale of the procession that we're seeing, the beauty, actually, the majesty. This, and I thought this earlier, actually, when I was watching the service as well. It's fit for a queen.
Yes. A service fit for a queen.
It's a service fit for a queen, and this is a procession worthy of her, specifically, not just any queen and her service. And actually, just watching the royal family themselves, who've been on display ever since we lost her once again. And even the children, I know we've shown a few images in the last few moments of the Prince of Wales's children, George and Charlotte, and the fact that even they walked in the procession earlier. I mean, these are iconic images.
Yeah. When you look at her coffin, you know, every detail she picked, but there was one, I'm told, that the King Charles III picked, which was part of the flowers, and it was a flower that was derived from her
wedding bouquet.
Right.
Yes. And but Charles is, you know, the consummate gardener, and he would know exactly what flowers she would have loved. But also, he had a mind for tradition and that, you know, myrtle and heather.
Something so intimate as well, to choose that flower. There's great elements of love within all the pomp and ceremony that we've been discussing, and at its core. And I'll always bring it back to this. It's still a family, and we share in the family, and they're part of our history and our institution, but it is still a family. I couldn't agree more.
Well, the wonderful juxtaposition, really, on the coffin of these symbols of state juxtaposed with flowers, which are really symbols of love.
Tricia, this is what the feeling that is being conveyed through our television screens, this is what it's like to be in London, as I was there. And in the beginning, there was sort of this consternation. Do we celebrate the new king? Do we mourn the passing of the queen? How do we do them both in tandem?
I think you do. I think we do, because we saw
this is what's being conveyed on our screen, with the sound of the march, and everyone is just sort of walking around going, what is happening?
I think both. I mean, with the minute's silence, I think it was interesting. After the minute's silence, everyone all around, you heard people break into cheers and applause and what have you. With grief, with ending, comes a new beginning. And I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. I think while mourning the Queen, we're also mourning the end of a really difficult time for the world, for Britain. There's a lot of grief here, but there's a lot of hope for the future. And I couldn't agree more seeing the Prince and Princess of Wales, their children with Camilla in the Queen Consort, pointing out the landmarks. It is about the sad death of the past. There they are, they're the children. But it's also about the future, and that embodies the future. That picture right there absolutely embodies the future.
Tricia, to your point, you know, there is a difference between the demise of a queen and the making of a king.
Oh, yeah.
In the UK, obviously, that transition happens immediately. As soon as the queen dies, King Charles becomes king. However, I think